Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining our online webinar event on the topic of geopolitics, order, and influence in the Pacific Islands. My name is Connor O'Brien. I'm a PhD student and a research assistant at the Centre, and I'll be the host tonight. We are delighted to have three fantastic speakers for tonight's event. First, Maima Koro, who has over 20 years of international development experience in the Pacific at national and regional levels, and is now undertaking a PhD at the University of Adelaide. We have William Waqavakatoga, who has served in the British Army and worked as a broadcast journalist, and is now also undertaking a PhD at the University of Adelaide. And finally, we have Professor Joanne Wallis, who graduated with a PhD from the University of Cambridge and serves as Research Director of the Security in the Pacific Islands program in the Stretton Institute at the University of Adelaide. So this is a fantastic set of speakers for our topic, geopolitics, order, and influence in the Pacific Islands. Tonight's event will comprise three different 15 to 20-minute presentations on the webinar topic, followed by an audience Q&A session. So at the end of the three presentations, please feel free to send in your questions and I'll make sure to ask them to the panelists. With that, I'll now hand over to Maima to begin the first presentation for tonight's event.
Thank you, Connor. Let me just bring up the slides. Greetings. It is a privilege to be here to share Pacific perspectives on the geopolitical climate pushing into the region. There's currently a lot of discussion about geopolitical competition in the Pacific Islands. Most of the discussion, however, amongst metropolitan powers are informed by their rationalist assumptions. By way of structure, I will start with the rules-based order, present a Pacific view of geography and state, and I will then highlight some of the dilemmas with the existing geopolitical environment, and then conclude with a Pacific view of order. Pacific leaders have expressed their concerns about the behavior of big powers in their region, and that importantly, many do not share the same perceptions of or concerns about geopolitical competition in the same way that big powers do. Protecting the international rules-based order is at the center of geopolitical competition in the Pacific. But there is no consensus on what exactly is the rules-based order, also referred to as the global rules order or the rules-based system. A quick online search revealed the multitude of interpretations from academia, policymakers, think tankers, government officials, including community members, about how the term is used and or applied. According to Professor Malcolm Chalmers of the Royal United Services Institute, there is no one single base rule system. He argues that the rules-based order is a power bargain system. There are different rules and objectives operating within these multiple intersecting systems. They are the universal security system, the international law system, and the economic world order. Others have also argued that the rules-based international order is nothing more than a tool for a select group of countries to advance their own hegemonic or exploitative ambitions. This US-led post-World War II system has and can be used to help pursue national interests and values, including whether these norms and rules need to be developed or replaced as circumstances change. So what is real? It is a fact that the Pacific spans a unique, diverse, and dynamic region. From north to south of the Pacific Ocean, the Pacific occupies a vast oceanic region that covers almost 30% of the Earth's surface. According to the World Bank, Pacific Island member countries have a combined population of about 2.3 million people across a unique and diverse region. Pacific countries are rich in natural resources, contain extraordinary linguistic and cultural diversity. the region confronts many of the worst impacts of climate change and are some of the world's most vulnerable countries to climate disasters. Inspired by Tongan academic, the late Professor Ebeli Hauofa Sea of Islands, the first point I would make is that the Pacific people view the region as a collective of big ocean states and not as small, isolated, and fragile islands. This powerful image, drawn to counter Western view of Pacific Islands as isolated, non-viable economies, has so far gone unchallenged. Pacific leaders have endorsed this vast oceanic blue Pacific identity to counter perceptions of Pacific countries as small, isolated, and weak states. The second perspective is that in the Pacific, the concept of state extends beyond governments and institutions. And here I will use Samoa as a case study. Sorry, I think I've just missed one there. I will go on here to talk about the mapping of the Pacific. In the Pacific, geopolitical competition is not new. Historically, geopolitical contests remapped the region. Maritime boundaries were drawn and redrawn, according to Associate Professor Tarcisius Kaputaulaka, to exert geopolitical, geostrategic, and geoeconomic interests and create and maintain global power and worldviews. Within the Blue Pacific continent, colonial power still exists in French Polynesia, as outlined on the map, Wallis and Futuna and New Caledonia as French territories. The Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, Guam, Hawaii, and American Samoa are territories under the US authority. The Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, and the Republic of Marshall Islands have compact arrangements with the United States. New Zealand has Cook Islands, Niue, and Tokelau with realm arrangements. That's the physical aspect. The colonial mindset, however, to a large extent has remained. Hence, the insisting geopolitical framing of shaping, influence, and control in the interest of the rules-based order remains. Who actually gains from such an order? So previously, I mentioned Samoa as a case study. Samoa considers its system of democracy as cultural democracy. Basically, there are two key governance systems intertwined and embedded in the Samoa political economy. There is the Fa'a Samoa, which consists of the Samoan culture and traditions, values, beliefs, and includes religion. Samoa has many layers, and Samoa also has blended these values with Western democratic principles to strengthen its political economy. It is a collaboration of two systems. For example, the traditional leadership system Fa'amatai was incorporated into the electoral system when Samoa gained independence. In 1990, the then government legislated the traditional village governance system as part of the state. The Village Whānau Act formalized customs and traditions that had been inherited and are now in place. In 1991, in support of the universal suffrage, Samoa also then legislated to allow under over 21 years of age to vote in the electoral system. However, only the Matais go into parliament. So it's very clear that notions of state and geography perspectives are very different. So what can we know about the ethical dilemmas that have been confronted as a result of the geopolitical environment? Guam is located in Micronesia in the western North Pacific Ocean, as you can see from the map. It has the longest history of colonization in the world. The US established a strategic military post in Guam. Today, the US occupies 29% of the land in military, displacing indigenous Chamorro people. This will potentially increase with the Biden administration announcing last year, and I quote, "The largest ever budget request for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative and investment in advanced capabilities for more resilient force posture in the Indo-Pacific region, enabling groundbreaking posture initiatives in Guam." The people of Guam are externally defined by US strategic imperialism as the frontline first island chain, an indispensable strategic hub for the United States that allows the US to successfully project power within the Indo-Pacific region. Without asking to be part of a war, Guam has become the most likely target at risk of existential harm. It is no wonder the current geopolitical climate, understanding your role is a projection of power to others, and whatever that means, is a never-ending nightmare. Summed up by respected academic and community leader, Associate Professor Kenneth Cooper, and I quote, "We have experienced being forced in the middle of war conflicts before with World War II, and we just don't want the same thing to happen like that again." Then there is the dilemma of the nuclear age in the Pacific. The French conducted 193 nuclear experiments above and beneath Mururoa and Whangatauwha atolls between July 1966 and January 1996. Both atolls are located southeast of French Polynesia. Well documented also is the deception of the people of Bikini Atoll, where a US commander told the people to leave their island temporarily so nuclear tests could be conducted for the good of mankind. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 23 nuclear devices at Bikini Atoll, including 20 hydrogen bombs. Amongst those was the bomb which was considered to be 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb that destroyed Nagasaki in 1945. The people of Bikini Island never returned to their home. It is through these experiences that regional leaders pushed for a Pacific nuclear-free zone and their cautionary reaction to the United Kingdom, United States, and Australia AUKUS Pact. In the current geopolitical environment, relationships have been securitized, international partners have been weaponized, and Pacific countries are being asked to decide. In the words of one European official, "The Pacific will always be colonized. It's either us or others. Which would you prefer?" The colonial mindset, though outdated, remains. Shaping, influence, and control are measured to a large extent in strategic security partnerships and diplomatic relations, leading to funding pledges and photo opportunities. So how shall we act? Exercising agency over the decisions they make in their national interest, Pacific countries are reaffirming their political and security choices under the banner of friends to all, enemies to none. Referring to the existing global competition, Pacific elder Dame Meg Taylor warned Pacific people that nothing given to them by bigger powers came without owing something in return. And what is it that we're going to owe them? Are we going to owe them places for military bases, Are we going to owe them places for their influence and control of the Pacific Ocean? Or are we going to owe them so they have access to our resources? Exercising sovereignty to counter geopolitical pressure, the Samoa Prime Minister stated last year, and I quote, "I feel the need to be very frank that in the Pacific, we feel our partners have fallen short of acknowledging the integrity of Pacific leadership and the responsibility they carry for every decision made as a collective and individually in order to garner support for the sustainable development of our nations. The contest to shape, influence, and control undermines trustful relationships and effective partnerships. The rules-based order in the Pacific context is defined by others based on their strategic agenda. It continues an outdated mindset that others know what is best for the people of the Pacific. It is often framed in ideological terms, economic partnerships, freedoms, and values. But the question remains, who actually benefits from the multiplicity of the international order? Going beyond institutions, who is actually benefiting from such order? For the Pacific, leaders have endorsed the Blue Pacific strategy and directed partners to align to the priorities outlined therein. They are long-standing priorities. Pacific people have called for values such as respect and equality as the currency of influence across foreign and diplomatic relations. With over 40 years of independence in most Pacific countries and with the return of geopolitical competition, Pacific people are reviewing their governance arrangements and systems to enhance their democracies and will continue to do so. In this space, their relational values, relevant customs and traditions will be prominent. These relational values, customs and traditions have regulated, sustained, and brought order to communities. To conclude, geopolitics is traditionally about military and economic power or influence. Power or influence in the Pacific context is multidimensional. As relational societies, concepts such as power influence is about the quality of social interactions, social structures, and relationships. Pacific people are increasingly concerned that they will suffer the consequences of this unstable contest all over again. Professor Kenneth Booth has stated that world theories of security have been imprisoned by conservative thinking. Much of this outdated thinking has dominated geopolitics. It is time to quote Amitav Acharya for a global international relations that recognizes the voices, experiences, and values of peoples. Perspectives do differ, but whose perspectives matters? And what is security in the context of geopolitics? And who gains? Thank you, Professor Hurst, Connor, and your team for the invitation and the excellent facilitation. And I apologize for the mishap earlier on in the order of the PowerPoints. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maima, for that fantastic first presentation. We'd now like to invite William to present the next portion of tonight's event, looking at the order aspect of the topic.
Nisa Mulavinaka, and good evening. I first would like to thank the Center for Geopolitics for this opportunity to share my topic, Rethinking International Relations from a Pacific Islands perspective. My topic is centered on my current PhD research project titled Pacific Island Countries in International Relations, a case study of Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. The project is now entering the second year and is being supervised by Professor Joanne Wallis and Associate Professor Timra Grant here in Adelaide. Today's presentation is primarily focused on why it is important to rethink IR from a Pacific Islands perspective and how I am going to go about in this rethinking. At present, I am in the literature review stage of my research with the conceptual framework to be designed immediately after. I've cleared the ethics stage with the full work, cleared the ethics stage with full work planned to be conducted later in July this year. Before any rethinking takes place, there is a need to revert to the fundamental question raised to any first-year undergraduate student in IR: what is it? International relations, capital I, capital R. The clarity of what international relations is needs to be established from the beginning for the purpose of rethinking. And I provide three explanations. The first one is given by the British International Studies Association. Okay, I've highlighted in green states. Okay, as I'm drawing out some of the key concepts that are similar across the literature review that I've been going through. So when we're talking about international relations uppercase, we're specifically looking at the discipline itself. And then when we look at the small I, small r, then we're looking at the interactions of the states. And I also have an explanation given by the Oxford Dictionary of Politics. Do note that there's a lot of debate on what international relations is, but the idea is to get a sense of understanding of the fundamental, which is critical for how I'll be laying out my research project. World War I is considered by many scholars as a catalyst to the establishment of a discipline to address the causes of war and conditions for peace, with the University of Wales considered as one of the early universities to have delivered the discipline in 1919 with the endowment of a professional chair in international politics. At the time, there were two other IR think tanks created, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London in 1920, and its journal, International Affairs in 1922, and the Council on Foreign Relations in New York in 1921, makes a case on the formal development of discipline. But on the other side of the coin, scholars like Amitav Acharya, Barry Buzan argue international relations was clearly on the way of becoming institutionalized as an academic discipline or field of study well before 1914. But it was only 1919 and after that when this institutionalization really took off, a phenomenon that was repeated again after the Second World War. And after the Second World War and into the 1950s, there were serious debates on what constituted international relations. The academic study of IR is a heavily contested domain and has been divided into different contending schools of thoughts, approaches, theories, and methodologies. It is important from the viewpoint of my own research that it captures aptly the discourse of what international relations is, as the foundation block provides guidance in my rethinking aspect. Why should IR be reimagined in Oceania? Or why should the discipline of international relations be rethought or reimagined? The glaring response would be, why not? Pacific historians account for much of the scholarship on the diplomatic interactions and interstate regional relations of the pre-colonial period in Oceania. On the other hand, political scientists examining the international relations have paid little attention to its pre-colonial interstate system. Instead, the latter has largely been left to historians and anthropologists. But this is changing, and one project I'm currently aware of is the Oceanic Diplomacy Project out of the Australian National University, led by Professor Greg Fry. So how did Pacific Islands think of international relations before European contact? I use one quote that I think captures concisely where this research project is situated. and this quote is by Zaya Zakol. In IR, non-Western states and peoples are frequently understood as without international politics or an interest in the world at large until Europeans brought them into a global order in the 19th century. That is, they are understood to be local actors only. Now, contrast Zakol's statements with Hedley Bull's view that prior to colonization, there were independent political communities held together by ties of lineage or kinship, in which there was no such institutions as governments, and entities such as these fall outside the purview of international relations. How did Pacific Islanders think of international relations before European contact? Buzan suggests reimagining IR is primarily about rethinking foundational knowledge of what constitutes IR. It calls for creating alternative sites of knowledge construction with an alternative set of tools and resources. With consideration to the explanation of what international relations is, provided in the earlier slides, I apply that to Oceania. The rethinking for this project is guided by Saeed Farid's Atlas indigenization approach, in that the idea is not to completely reject Western social sciences, but in a way incorporate with my own understanding, or rather what the understanding of this research will reveal with it. This research will recognize the existing fundamental concepts of the discipline, even though this may be contentious. For example, state centralism in the study of international relations itself. The approach to my research is also inspired by Zakol's book, Before the West. In the introduction, Zakol suggests to the reader to imagine a situation often depicted in fantasy novels where you discover a portal that will take you to another parallel universe. So in my rethinking, I've transported myself to this parallel universe of what it would be like today, having never been colonized. As an Oceania insider and knowing what I know, the word colorful comes to mind, but not in the flowery sense. Roy Smith encourages scholars of international relations to focus beyond the traditional study of external relations between sovereign states and suggests to focus on the global organizations of political authority and on the human and environmental consequences of such organizations. And so this leads me to how I would go about reimagining or rethinking IR in the Pacific. And to do that, I have selected a geographical area involving Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. And one of the reasons why I have selected this area is purely because of the high degree of interaction between the three states of three places in prehistoric times. So this leads us to the research question that's for my research. What does the evolution of the states for Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga in Oceania inform us about the international relations? When we think back to historic times, okay, there's no such thing as states that you see here. Okay, so something that I've kept in the back of my mind is to focus more on the geography sense rather than saying that I'm looking at Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. And so the point is that while I've have a box in which to go about focusing on, it may go outwards to other Pacific Island countries. Why should the examination of the evolution of the state for Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga in Oceania matter in IR? So in order for the research to take place, I'll be focusing initially on two areas in Fiji. The first will be in Kandavu, which is south of Fiji, and the second would be the island of Rotuma. So the idea is to start from the village level and to work my way up to the interactions between islands across the region. Okay, so concepts, using political science lenses, still at the literature review stage. Okay, these are some concepts that I would say would perhaps be roughly the equivalent to it in terms of Fiji and the italic Fijian words. So starting from, for example, the concept of nations, what similarities do I find in terms of language, dialects, the customs, the kava ceremonies, polities, how much into the direct translation is government, and how this is structured from the village level upwards. And the focus would be on how these polities interact with each other. The state, made up of several polities, would that make up state? So in other words, the way that I'm going about this research later on in the year is to try and identify some of these concepts that are already in IR and figure out if there's an equivalent to what we have in Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. So sovereignty, who and how was sovereignty recognized? In Fiji, for example, for chiefs, in order for them to take the role as a chiefs, there must be somebody else to provide them or to provide them the kava drink for them to be recognized as a legitimate authority. So it is more of explaining how the dynamics of the polities work in relation to the structures or the concepts of international relations that we have existing concepts. Territoriality, which is big in the modern state today. How was territoriality understood in the Pacific region? Could canoes be considered as part of territoriality? Kinship is also very important, is also an important bond in the Pacific Islands region, also particularly Fiji. And in some ceremonies that are conducted, they literally talk about the relationship, the blood relations that ties people together. So could that be thought of as a form of territoriality? This will be explored by starting from Kandavu and working outwards to other Pacific Island countries and also within Fiji also. So it is not restricted to one island, but I'm trying to capture the relationships from one village to another. So Kandavu, for example, has over 70 villages, and those 70 villages can be broken down into different districts where they have their own chief. And each chief has a relationship to another place in Fiji. It is I'm attempting to capture how these relationships develop in terms of the concepts discussed here. And finally, we are a qualitative study, and at this point in time, I'm looking at grounded theory, Strauss and Corbin's open coding. And finally, there's a lot of new research contribution coming in from the Global South. If IR is to be inclusive, I think time is right for Oceania to contribute also in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, William. That was brilliant. And now to bring the final presentation, we'd like to invite Joanne to conclude before we have the Q&A.
Well, hi, everybody, and thank you very much for having me part of this today. So today I'm talking about a project that I've been running for the last year and a half. We've got another 6 months going, funded by Australia's Department of Defence by a Defence Strategic Policy grant. It's funded by them, but of course the views are entirely those of the research team and not of the department. And it's called Statecraftiness, and we're analysing how partner states are deploying statecraft in the Pacific Islands and what this means for Australia. So there is a reason why Pacific leaders now describe the island's geopolitical landscape as crowded and complex. In a context of heightened strategic competition, partner states have sought to improve their reputations and relationships in the region. But this urgent energy poses risks, and it's been difficult to track which partner state is doing what and where. And this might lead to their activities being poorly targeted, duplicative, or overwhelming the absorptive capacity of Pacific Island countries. So to help address this, since mid-2022, our Statecraftiness project has been creating an interactive story map to collate data on the major tools of statecraft being deployed by partner states in the region and to map where these tools are being deployed. This is accompanied by a podcast that features Pacific thinkers' reflections on being the targets of these statecraft efforts, and a series of policy papers and journal articles, and we have a book coming out later this year. I lead the project, and you can see the rest of the team on the slide. So in this presentation, I discuss our major findings, outline our recommendations about how scholars and practitioners can understand statecraft in the Pacific Islands region, and identify implications for Australia's foreign and strategic policy. So any assessment of the effectiveness of individual tools of statecraft needs to acknowledge that there is no direct causal line between deployment of a tool of statecraft and the advancement of a partner state's policy. Instead, we understand that statecraft describes the actions that states take to try, notable they try, they don't always succeed, to change three factors that determine the success of their foreign and strategic policy: their external environment, the policies and/or behaviour of target states, actors, communities or individuals, and the beliefs, attitudes and opinions of those target states, actors, communities or individuals. The converse is also true. Correlation between, for example, the deployment of tools of statecraft by a partner state and a change in the policies or behaviour of a Pacific Island country that is the target of those tools of statecraft does not necessarily mean that one caused the other. This is because the deployment of statecraft tools does not generate unilinear effects. And whether attempts to influence by partner states are successful is ultimately determined by the receptivity of the Pacific Island states that are those targets. The policies and behaviour of Pacific Island countries are determined primarily by their own domestic political imperatives, and responses to attempts to influence policies and behaviour are mediated by their governments, which each possess agency and operate within unique political structures and socio-political cultures. For example, while the US has tried to get has managed, to get Papua New Guinea to agree to a defence cooperation agreement, that agreement is unpopular domestically, as it's perceived to draw PNG into the militarisation of the region. There are concerns that the agreement violates PNG's long membership of the non-aligned movement, and the constitutionality of potential immunities granted to American personnel is now subject to a court challenge. Similarly, the Australian Vanuatu security agreement that was signed in late 2022 has been unpopular with both the government and opposition, and the agreement has been cited as a contributing factor to the successful vote of no confidence in then Prime Minister Ismail Kelsakau. The recent Falepili union between Australia and Tuvalu has also been controversial domestically, and it may not survive the installation of the new government in Tuvalu following the recent elections. The deployment of statecraft tools must also be analysed in relative rather than absolute terms. You'll see here on the slide, I've included screenshots from our story map. Unfortunately, they're static. My computer would crash if I installed the interactive maps, but when you go to our story map, each of these maps is interactive and you can read more and check the data that I'm telling you. So the deployment of tools of statecraft, as I said, must be analysed in relative rather than absolute terms. It is easy to draw incorrect and I'd argue at times catastrophizing conclusions when one partner state's activities are considered in isolation from others. But when partner states' activities are analysed in comparison to each other, a much more accurate picture emerges. For example, the event that motivated much recent interest in the region was the April 2018 rumour that China was seeking to establish a military base in Vanuatu. The April 2022 news that China and Solomon Islands had entered into a security agreement further amplified anxieties about a potential Chinese military presence in the region. But despite all the discussion about a potential Chinese military presence, what is often overlooked is the existing military presence of allies in the Pacific Islands region. And our story map shows that the US and France have an extensive military presence and can scale that presence up quickly if needed. Australia also has an indirect presence through its Pacific Maritime Security Program. Similarly, there are concerns that the Solomon Islands-China security agreement has paved the way for much more evident presence of Chinese police. After China provided police training in Solomon Islands in 2022, Australia countered by donating rifles and police vehicles to compete against the Chinese police training. And then China in turn donated water cannons, motorbikes and vehicles. That's just an illustration of this dynamic of competition that is occurring in the region. But our story map shows that China's rather nascent policing activities are nowhere near as broad-reaching as the assistance provided by Australia and New Zealand. Again, this is all in interactive form on our map. Comparing the deployment of statecraft tools in relative terms suggests an analytical focus on quantity. Now, quantity is important, but it doesn't necessarily equate to the quality or effectiveness of those tools of statecraft. For example, an overemphasis on quantity by partner states keen to be seen to be doing something, and there's quite a lot of that happening in the Pacific at the moment, in response to China's activism, has meant that small-scale programs run by civil society groups that are perceived by partner states as having less public relations value are no longer or not receiving funding from those traditional partners. And this is even for, we cite in our work, even for inexpensive items like chairs, tables and computers to assist vulnerable communities. But often these small-scale programs are the most effective way of delivering development and of actually, ironically, of improving the donor's reputation. They might not come accompanied by a glossy media release or great photo opportunity, but actually that often is the assistance that does the most good. Drawing on our story map, the difference between quantity and quality is well illustrated by diplomatic presence and visits. Australia is the only partner state with diplomatic posts in all Pacific Island countries, followed closely by New Zealand, and then in descending order by Japan and China. And the US has engaged in a recent surge in diplomatic post openings or intended openings. But the number of diplomatic posts that a country has doesn't necessarily equate to quality or effectiveness of the statecraft delivered by the diplomats in those posts. And this is because individuals, not policies, are actually the most important determinants of whether a country's statecraft efforts succeed. High-level visits to the Pacific by foreign leaders and officials have also increased dramatically in the past 18 months. We've seen Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, French President Emmanuel Macron, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, British Foreign Minister James Cleverly, and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi have all made appearances in the last couple of years. But the quantity of diplomatic engagement does not necessarily lead to quality relationships. And the quality of diplomats matters, their emotional quotient, their attitude, their ability to understand others, and their cultural understanding. And this highlights that diplomats are not carbon copies of one another. Each has their own foibles, habits, strengths, and weaknesses. And their individual personalities are adjudicated and assessed intensely in the capital cities where they work, as are those of all the other actors of statecraft, like police officers, military officials, and assorted contractors. Beyond high-level diplomatic engagement, public diplomacy is an increasingly prominent tool of statecraft, and social media is a popular mechanism for partner state diplomats to seek to engage with Pacific people. Social media followings have also been found to affect diplomatic negotiations and shape diplomatic influence outside of formal meetings through their soft power implications. To try to understand the effectiveness of social media as a diplomatic tool, we analysed social media followings of diplomatic missions in the region. This table on the slide is actually from a conversation article we published that summarised our findings. As expected, countries with close relationships tend to have high followers. Australia has a reasonably high social media reach throughout the region, particularly in Papua New Guinea, which is its close neighbour and a former colonial territory. The US also has a large social media following in the PNG, Timor-Leste and Solomon Islands. But here we note that social media engagement does not necessarily indicate that people agree with or even think favourably of a country. For example, the large following of the US Embassy in Papua New Guinea could be due to recent controversies involving the mission there, or to also the US Papua New Guinea Defence Cooperation Agreement. Assessing the effectiveness of diplomacy in the region highlights the importance of analysing statecraft over the long rather than the short term. And this was illustrated by the US's response to the Solomon Islands-China Security Agreement. After the agreement was signed, the US immediately sent senior diplomatic officials to Solomon Islands, despite not having a formal diplomatic presence there for 29 years. The US's long absence undermined the value of these diplomatic visits, as, and I quote here, Maima and William and some of the rest of our Pacific team in a report they've recently authored, which is on the screen. It's the quality of relationships that determines outcomes far more so than might and money in the Pacific. And the quality of those relationships, Maima, William and their co-authors point out, builds up over time. The value of developing relationships in and knowledge of, the Pacific Islands region over the long term highlights the importance of Pacific literacy in partner states, both in political and official sectors and in the wider public. Now, there are large Pacific diasporas in Australia, New Zealand and the US, but there is still limited understanding of Pacific cultures and languages in those states, including in policymaking and political circles. Language is important to Pacific literacy and can affect the effectiveness of diplomacy. And you'll see on our story map, we map where all the different Pacific language training programs are around the world. New Zealand has done by far the most to promote Pacific languages. Australia is fairly poor, with only Pacific languages taught in a concerted way at one university. And the situation is the same in the US. Only the University of Hawaii and the University of Guam teach Pacific languages. Notably, China has increased its Pacific language programs. The Beijing Foreign Studies University teaches actually more Pacific languages than are taught in Australia. China has also established 7 centres dedicated to Pacific studies in universities across China. And an observation that we often make and our colleagues often make is that Chinese diplomats in the Pacific are often fluent in Pacific languages. While there are varying levels of language ability from diplomats from traditional partner states who are deployed in the region. Beyond language, understanding is also developed through the media. Australia, China, New Zealand, the UK and the US all broadcast their state media into the region. Australia and New Zealand are the most present in the region. The UK only has the World Service, which of course is not in local languages, as does the US broadcast Voice of America, again, not in Pacific languages. China also has television and radio presence in the region, and its news agency, Xinhua, has agreements to share content around the region. Soft power tools of statecraft, such as media broadcasts, scholarships, church networks, language training and cultural exchanges are often looked in analyses of partner states' activities in the Pacific Island region. Though most of the analyses that you do see tend to focus on more quantifiable tools such as aid, loans, infrastructure projects and security assistance. But this misses the value of these soft power tools of statecraft over the long term, as they have the potential to shape the beliefs, attitudes and opinions of actors, communities or individuals. Now, the way that they do this is often harder to immediately identify, but it might influence the outlook of a government and consequently its policies in the long term. Led by our University of Adelaide colleague Priestley Hubrew, a group of Australia Award recipients from the Pacific wrote the policy paper on my screen that discusses their experiences of holding one of these scholarships and how it has shaped their views of Australia. Now, one of the main challenges of compiling our story map and of analysing the deployment of tools of statecraft more generally is distinguishing between the announcement and the implementation of tools of statecraft. As partner states deploy tools of statecraft to employ their reputation and relationships, they tend to announce these tools through media releases and press conferences to maximise the attention that they receive. This can mean that these announcements are interpreted as more significant than their political outcomes when and if is really important here, they are ever actually implemented. The gap between announcement and implementation was illustrated by the 2020 announcement that China's Ministry of Commerce had agreed to an Australian $204 million deal with the Papua New Guinea government to establish, and I quote here, a comprehensive multifunctional fisheries industrial park project on Daru Island in Papua New Guinea. Australia was concerned that this fishing park would give China a foothold only a few kilometres from Australia. Australia reacted quickly, signing a memorandum of understanding of its own with the Papua New Guinea government worth $30 million for an economic empowerment program on Daru. Now, since 2020, there's been no substantive progress on the Chinese project, but it's unlikely that Australia's very quick reaction had influenced this. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic might have delayed things, but the more plausible explanation why we haven't seen anything happen is the project was, and I quote here, an outlandishly ambitious mirage that will never eventuate. Now, look, any development on Daru Island, long a neglected region, is welcome. I'm not arguing I'm against Australia's memorandum of understanding to advance development on Daru. But the speed of Australia's reaction to the Chinese announcement exemplified how the significance of such announcement can be misinterpreted. Another challenge we've encountered is of identifying the source of tools of statecraft. This is due to partner states frequently subcontracting out the delivery of their statecraft to state-owned enterprises, as in the case of China, or to private contractors, non-government organisations or multilateral institutions, in the case of Australia, the US, New Zealand and other partners. Now, this generates two phenomena. The first is that it's often unclear which partner state is funding a tool of statecraft. As colleagues from the Pacific have told us, with so much Australian development assistance provided by private contractors and non-government organisations, the average Pacific person often doesn't realise that it comes from Australia, New Zealand, the UK and so on. For example, many local level health and education programs are provided by non-government organisations such as World Vision or Save the Children with Australian funding. And as one Pacific colleague commented, it's their t-shirts that people see. Australia's name isn't anywhere. Similarly, Australian policing assistance is increasingly provided by private contractors rather than by Australian police. For example, in Vanuatu, Palladium, which is a contractor, is providing policing, justice and community services. Now, there are Australian federal police officers in Vanuatu, but they are managed by Palladium, which gives the impression that the Australian government has contracted private companies to manage Australian officials. So this means that while Australia might tot up the value of its development assistance and assume that by quantity and relative to other partners, it's deploying a considerable amount of statecraft tools, the recipients of these tools are often unaware that Australia is the one that's actually funding them. It often means that key Australian government messaging that Australia thinks is improving its relationships and reputation in the Pacific doesn't translate through the many layers of outsourcing. The second phenomenon is the wrong partner state often gets credit for providing tools of statecraft, and this is most evident when it comes to infrastructure projects. Prominent analyses have argued in the last 5 years that through China's Belt and Road Initiative of funding infrastructure projects, China is really increasing its presence and reputation in the region and elsewhere. But while many infrastructure projects in the Pacific are quite right, being built by Chinese state-owned enterprises, many of these projects are actually funded by multilateral institutions such as the Asian Development Bank, rather than by the Chinese government. And as a result, indirectly by Australia, the US and other donors to that bank. So this is because Chinese companies are often the sole bidders for infrastructure tenders, and they often bid very low to secure the contract. For example, Chinese companies have received 80% of the Asian Development Bank contracts in the Pacific. So this means that China often gets the credit and the consequent reputational boost for projects that it doesn't actually fund. That also, of course, feeds into analyses of statecraft in the region too, that scholars assume that China is funding all this behaviour, these activities, when they're actually indirectly funded by their own government, Australia and the US and other governments. Just here, by necessity, we focused our story map primarily on the activities of partner states. We do acknowledge that the activities of non-government actors, including civil society groups and organisations such as churches, plays an important role in statecraft. So just in conclusion, what should Australia and its partners and allies do? So the data we've collected and analysed for our story map reveals that Australia and its allies and partners, particularly New Zealand and the US, have by far the most extensive presence in the Pacific Islands region and deploy by far the greatest and most expansive range of tools of statecraft. And look, these partner states, Australia and New Zealand, the US and others, do have legitimate strategic concerns about China's increasingly visible presence in the Pacific. But when the size and impact of China's tools of statecraft in the region is evaluated, we argue that Australia and others can actually afford to be less anxious than they have been. And we argue that this means that Australia, the US, New Zealand and others have the time and space to ensure that their deployment of tools of statecraft in the Pacific is responsive rather than reactive. Since 2018, there have been too many reactions, unthinking reactions, we argue, by partner states. Another example here is the rumours that China Mobile was in talks to acquire the region's largest private telco, Digicel. Australia reacted, quickly funding its own telco, Telstra, with US $1.33 billion to acquire Digicel. That figure was larger than the Australian aid budget for the region. But the economic and development case behind this purchase has been questioned, as has its potential reputational risks for Australia if Digicel is unable to lower mobile internet prices, which have long been a concern in the region, and comes into conflict with domestic regulators in Pacific Island countries. So instead of reacting to every Chinese announcement or initiative, Australia, the US, New Zealand and other partner states need to shift to responding proactively. This responsive approach would recognise the risk of over-interpreting the impact of tools of statecraft, particularly when they are viewed in isolation and in the short term. Instead, each partner state's statecraft should be analysed relative to other partners over the long term, with a focus on implementation rather than announcement, acknowledging the difference between quality and quantity and between correlation and causation, and with an eye to identifying the source of the tool of statecraft. By collating the tools of statecraft being deployed by partner states, our story map offers a good place for partners to begin this responsive analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. And thank you again to William and Maima for your presentations. That was fabulous. I'm going to ask a few questions just to kick things off, but if anyone in the audience has any questions, please feel free to message them into the Q&A box and I'll be reading them and CK will be reading them as well, and we'll proceed to ask them and make sure you've had the chance to get your input. I think the thing I thank you all for presentations. I found very interesting essentially this kind of a few different suggestions, but first of all, taking this idea of proactive responsiveness, but in a proactive rather than reactive way, but then also taking the work of Maima and William in talking about the importance of relationality and relationships, and as well as looking at, not outside of the traditional box of IR and geopolitics, to think about how IR works, international relations works in the Pacific, and what Pacific leaders may want out of these interactions. So I thought I'd just ask each panelist, maybe starting with Maima, just to kind of give a sense of what you think, how you think the geopolitics, quote unquote, should be governed in this sense. So I'm thinking specifically of what sorts of development assistance do you think should be given? How do you think external powers like the US or China or Australia should be engaging with the region? And what sort of priorities do you think are most important in this geopolitical age of competition?
Thanks, Connor, for the questions. So I think really when the thing about priorities for the Pacific is that none of it is new. None of it is new in terms of that, you know, just being in Vanuatu, just being around Fiji and also around Samoa recently. Really, the things is about, you know, health, education. Those are the long-standing priorities of the Pacific. There's also you know, the need for infrastructure. These things are basic in terms of development, you know, good health systems, effective infrastructure in terms of roading, you know, transport systems, and then also the education system. Because much of the migration, if you go back, much of the migration and the need to migrate was for most of the Pacific Islands is due to better health, better education, and also the transport access to things. So that's one thing that I think that you know, development partners should really focus on. To give an example, I was in Vanuatu just last November. People were talking about how there was a massive investment into the improvements of policing, you know, facility up in Cook's, yet the health system needed a lot of support. So those are priorities, you know, those are the priority areas that Pacific leaders have always constantly talked about. So how is this given? Much of everything that we hear, nothing talks about localization. Nothing ever talks about the design that is actually driven from the ground. Yet you go to the countries, there's a lot of projects that fail because they miss understanding the context of how these things should be designed, how these things should be delivered. So this is also, you know, it's not unusual. You go through, there's a lot of structures that require a lot of maintenance, which is an issue in the Pacific. There's a collaboration around how should these things be designed so that actually that maintenance cost is minimized. Also the localization, local expertise is not recognized. It's not recognized. That is also a fact when it comes to the designing, you know. So we talk about a lot of things that should be enhanced, a lot of how the influence. Those things goes directly to influence. How the partnership should work, our relation, it's about respect. And that comes back to that point about respect. If you're going to design something, if you're going to make an announcement, why don't you start with them? And then start the design process from there, because there's been a lot of goodwill and funding that has been wasted just because of those missed opportunities for genuine collaboration. A lot of investment has been gone into imposing things in. A starting point would be from the ground perspective up. You get them to design, you share the ownership, and then you share the responsibility for maintenance. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for your thoughts there, Maima. William, do you have anything to add on that?
I think Maima's covered a bit on that. I would just say that recently I was in the United States. I had been invited over by one of the think tanks out of Washington. It was obvious to the Pacific Islanders in the room at this conference that there was a lot of what Maima touched on, a misunderstanding of the Pacific region. And mind you, these are Department of Defense officials. These are government departments in the US. I think there's an understanding at the high levels or understanding of diplomacy, but at the policy level, I think there's a lack of understanding of the region. And there was a former diplomat in the room. To put it bluntly, she didn't want to attend an event like that because she was disappointed with the level of engagement or the starting at the entry point of the engagement, which is problematic, and that carries on across all the geopolitical powers.
Thank you, William. And Joanne, anything else to add on that point as well?
I think I'd just reinforce what Maima and William have said, and Maima's response to your question was a really good example of the argument that we're making in the State Craftiness Project, is that you're seeing these reactions to announcements, and what Maima has said is exactly the point. Instead of these sort of reactive short-term responses, it needs to be long-term planning, a focus on localization. None of these things are necessarily sexy and come with a press release, But that actually, as Maima has said, is what delivers the best long-term outcomes, both for the Pacific and actually for the donor country. So this is, that really reinforces the argument, and Maima's illustrated very well that the argument that the sort of the thinking behind when we say it needs to be proactive, it needs to go out there and ask the Pacific, statecraft needs to go out there and ask the Pacific, what do you need? How is the best way to deliver this? Who is the best person to deliver it? Instead of these reactive, oh, China's done something, what can we do that might look the same or might provide an alternative? It's, that Maima's answer really well illustrates the argument of our project.
Yeah, fantastic. I'll just ask a follow-up question on that because I'm very interested in particular in how that works at the domestic political level in partner countries in the region. So I guess I want to ask, because what's part of this issue to some degree is that whether it be in Australia or the United States or potentially in China as well, but there's a significant, and New Zealand, of course, there's a significant focus on media reporting, for example, on when there is a rumored development in this space, whether it be through the China-US competition lens, etc. And that creates a lot of pressure on governments to deliver, equally with different economic misfortunes and perceptions that governments aren't delivering for their own citizens. There's a lot of pressure now on governments to decrease aid or to not increase their aid investment or to look for quick returns over the sort of long-term, more redistributive, localized investments you've talked about. So what I want to really ask is what do you think needs to be done about the politics of this? How could governments try to steer the conversation in a way to explain why those sorts of investments are actually better for targeting and reducing geopolitical tensions than the sort of more short-term investments that everyone's quite compellingly said may not be very effective, but seem to be very politically enticing for these governments?
Perhaps I'll start, if that's okay, Maima and William, just because I'm burning with an answer. Because it's something I've thought about a lot as an Australian. Obviously I'm thinking about the Australian context primarily. And it all comes down to the story that is being told by Australian leaders about the Pacific. And I argue in my work that story has been the wrong story for a very long time. And this comes down to the fact that story has been able to be told and has taken root, though, is indicative of, as I said in my presentation, there's a lack of Pacific literacy in Australia. There's just the average person does not know much about the Pacific. It's either a tourist destination, or if you listen to the media, it's somewhere where there's riots or there's coups, or, Australia needs to go and save the day in inverted commas. And things are improving. There is now much more visible presence of Pacific journalists in the Australian media, for example, but a lot of it comes down to the story that leaders are telling about the foreign policies that they need to implement, and telling the story that a much more positive, a much more accurate representation of the Pacific, so Pacific literacy improves. That will then create the space for a foreign policy that is much more able to deliver what Australia needs to do, but also what the Pacific needs. So a lot of it is just, I can completely understand where Australian leaders are coming from. They have this 24-hour news cycle. They have this need to be seen to be doing something. China does something. Oh, if the Australian government's not immediately out there seen to be countering it, the opposition in Parliament will be hounding them the next day that, they're letting Australia is going to be, subject to all these different threats if something's not done. But really, it's about leaders having a bit of backbone and saying, no, we don't need to be, we're just feeding into a cycle of action and reaction that is unhelpful. We're going to step back and we're going to be much more thoughtful about what we do. And, unfortunately, we're in a bit of a trap in Australia at the moment that the national security community in particular is so concerned about, most of the national security community in Australia is so concerned about the China threat that the political space for Australian leaders is very small, but there is still political space, and it's really just about Australian leaders having the bit of the backbone to stand up and offer an alternative story about strategic competition and about the Pacific.
Thanks, Joanne. And I think if I can just add to that, just along the lines of policy is policy, but people are people. And often that's really the equation as well. It's really about, you know, a lot of talk goes into this thing about people-to-people links, you know, and then you go into the islands at the time that everybody is talking about how they're looking at doing things better in terms of policy, the engagement, the shared values. You talk to the people on the ground and they're like, we're not engaged with so-and-so because they're so rude. Basics, absolute basics of human interaction. You know, people are exporting their corporate culture with them when they go on this, you know, overseas assignments, and they just can't break out of it. They just can't. One of those, you know, difficulty about breaking out is that they end up mixing within themselves, reinforcing the narrative that they are doing in the Pacific. So then miss the opportunity for, so what actually is people-to-people links? So a lot of that's influence. A lot of the, you know, the sustained interactions is not the policy. Policies always come and go when governments change. It's the people who have actually been on the ground, make those policy works, and also vice versa. This is, you know, I'm not saying, you know, everything is perfect and that there are good people, you know. I've been working in the technical assistance space for a long time, and they've been really excellent, you know, advisors who become. I think one of the points is that they are actually by default ambassadors of their countries. Nobody in the Pacific, when you go around, nobody knows you're from, you know, this organization, that organization. They just lump you in whether you're from the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. And that's just the package that they take. They understand that interaction at that level. So it's really important. Yes, policy is policy. I mean, I absolutely agree with Joanne, you know, about changing those narratives. Changing the mindset is really what is required. So how do you lift that? How do you lift that out of the politics? You know, where worldviews are so different.
I would just say that I think some of the Pacific leaders are bewildered with some of the excited reactions to some of the dealings that they conduct as sovereign Pacific Island countries.
Thank you very much for your answers there, Joanne, Maima, and William. I'm just going to defer to a question I've received. This question is directed to Joanne, and it states, you largely discussed Australia, New Zealand, the US, and Chinese engagement with the Pacific Islands, but last year, South Korea hosted the Pacific leaders to Korea for a summit. Japan announced to host Pacific leaders in July. What do we make of these non-traditional players in the Pacific engaging the region? And what would be the interest of Pacific Islanders to engage with them? I'd also broaden that last part out to everyone. But first, Joanne.
Thank you. Yes, in my presentation had Australia in the title, so I decided to focus on Australia in my comments, but we do cover South Korea, India, Indonesia, Japan, and all other partners in our story map. And I'm actually just working on a piece at the moment about Asia in the Pacific, it's called. And we focus on Korea, Japan, India, and Indonesia. Look, in terms of what those states are interested in the region, it really varies. I mean, Indonesia is a bit different to the others in that it has a very clear political interest in in the future of its West Papua region, and its lobbying of Pacific leaders on that topic. India has long-standing interests because of the Indian diaspora in Fiji. South Korea and Japan are a bit different because they don't have the same clear political interests. But, you know, Japan has been a donor in the Pacific for many decades. It's not a new player in the region. South Korea is newer, but South Korea's involvement to date, they did have their summit last year, but their actual, you know, I'm going to go against a little bit what I just said in my presentation, but the quantity of their engagement at the moment is not really substantial. But the attention of any of these powers offers opportunity for Pacific Island countries, because the more players that are present, the more options the Pacific Island countries have, and the more opportunities they have to hold existing and long-standing partners to account, because they can point to these new partners' interests, and also potentially, hopefully, that these new partners can kind of hold the long-standing partners a little bit, keep them on their game a bit. there are risks, though, for the Pacific of this influx of partner interest. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, there's the risk of duplication, of overwhelming, of poor targeting. And, this is something that is going to have to be managed. I think I mentioned in my presentation, but apologies if I didn't, that last year, 2022, I forget we're in 2024 now, but 2022, the US and other partners announced the Partners in the Blue Pacific initiative. And the stated intention behind that initiative is to help partner states coordinate with one another. But that Partners in the Blue Pacific initiative exemplifies a lot of the challenges that have been alluded to in the presentations today, is that it was announced without any substantive involvement Pacific Island countries, even though it's their region that it's talking about. Pacific officials were really only consulted in literally the days before that initiative was announced. There's been a few efforts since the announcement of the Partners in the Blue Pacific to engage with the Pacific Islands Forum and with other Pacific agencies, but nothing substantive. So, there is a risk that there's all these partners kind of stomping around, and that they might actually in many ways do more harm than good, or there could just be, at a minimum, at least, if not harm, there could just be wasted potential that money or funding or efforts is directed in areas where it's already well covered. So there's both opportunities and risks for the Pacific from these countries being involved in the region. As I say, we'll draw that more out in some work that we've got coming out soon.
And I think the only thing I would add to that is that Pacific countries, through the UN endorsed Samoa pathway, talks about partners. And that really is about, they will collaborate with partners who will look after, in terms of helping and assisting and supporting their development priorities. That will be that has been the flagship that all along for Pacific countries. And, Joanne is right that Japan has always been in the region. One of the very popular programs that JICA, I think, does in the region. And again, it's because these things target priorities. They are involved in things like water, waste, real localized issues that countries are trying to find solutions for. So their support through the technology that they have to help countries manage those really big issues for them, those are really, effective. The Peace Corps from the US, I understand, is going back. That is also a very successful program for the Pacific. It's a really good initiative. So, just coming back from Samoa, they're starting all over again, re-engaging, with the people on the ground. That's actually also very effective. There's volunteer programs as well going on, including some from New Zealand. But I think, the idea really from the Pacific perspective is that, don't dictate to us how we should decide, who we partner with. Because really the idea is that we do have priorities and development issues that we need to sort out, because the idea of the state extends beyond the notion of governments. People live in rural areas, access to that and the services to that has now become that priority. And going back into Vanuatu, they've got a 2030 strategy that is looking at, really reconnecting back to those, to their communities, because from their perspective, the government perspective is that they have left them behind. And that is not unusual. Tuvalu is going through the same thing. Samoa is going through the same thing. And also Kiribati is moving out to the outer islands. The idea that the state just sits in the hub of their capital cities does not work for them anymore. They have got communities to look after.
Fantastic. I wanted to ask a question, a follow-up question, probably one of the last questions given time, specifically about the non-Western concepts of Pacific international relations and Pacific Islands international relations. It was touched upon by Maima, and it was explicitly theorized with William. I wanted to ask, it seems as if it was a larger emphasis on what you've described on relationships, relationality, and less of a faith in certain kind of classical Western concepts like the sovereign state. What do you think that means for thinking about regionalism, and specifically how different countries in the Pacific relate to each other? Do you have any views on how that also should shape understandings of geopolitics? For example, there's been a lot of coverage about this question of partners in the Blue Pacific and this question of whether or not the Pacific Islands Forum is being undermined by external partners, or whether it's being circumvented, particularly with some of the Chinese diplomacy that went on in 2022. So I just wanted to pass that to the floor to hear some views on this, because it's another very important dimension of this discussion, is not just the question of priorities, but also the question of the concepts, vocabularies, and practices that really shape and form Pacific Islands international relations.
Okay, I'll go first. William, that's okay? Okay. Okay, I think, I mean, William is doing, fantastic research into this area, but this is really from a practical perspective around, the concepts really that, of the Pacific and how they actually interact with each other as individuals, as people. And then those concepts actually also underpins their interaction at the state level. That's because, and sometimes I feel like when we talk about this kind of values, it's seen as like it's a Pacific only thing, but it's not. This is universal values of respect, trust, these are the, and when we talk about relationships in terms of the Pacific, that's the safeguarding factor, the network that actually protects people, and also it puts order into our society. So in terms of sovereignty, it is absolutely, one of the things that Pacific leaders also always talks about is their agency, their sovereignty, being undermined, by the Western constructs and all of that. But that is only because in the sense that the models that Pacific have always been operated and with the interaction and with international relations is usually only at the government level. It leaves a large part of societies outside of that, So now there's a shift in engaging with civil society. There's a shift in engaging with church groups. There's a shift. And that's great, because that is actually the reality of Pacific countries. You don't just rock up to your, work environment and forget that you actually also wear multiple hats in the different settings that you are at. And then in terms of international relations, that is very important. Because we wrote about this in terms of our paper with Joanne, the concept of consultation, the idea to be consulted, the idea to give authority, to recognize authority, is very important in the Pacific sense. Pacific leaders, Prime Minister of Fiji has talked about the idea of equality. Those things are universal. Those are actually, but you gotta be able to recognize and deal with Pacific countries at that level. If you're dealing with international relations, bring those in, bring those relationships. Don't just talk about the policy. Don't just talk about what is going to be the outcome of the policy. It's how you make people feel. It's how you make people feel. This is where, interactions with some other, of the players, to give an example. Again, when I was in one of the Pacific countries, they were, one of the officials was talking that they've been working with some of their traditional partners for over 20 years. Every time they have to go through, there's a visa process that is unmatched by anything else. And also when you're in the interaction, when they work, it's really hard to work with them. They were asked to go to a non-traditional partner. They rolled out the red carpet. They've never felt being respected in the different scenes. Yes, they recognize there are other, there is also a catch to that. They want to, work with them. But the idea that you can be respected for who you are, not from a body, that speaks volumes. That is what sovereignty means also when Pacific leaders talk about sovereignty. It's about that respect.
Thank you, Maima. I would just say that Pacific Islands people, they're known for the migration, and it's been taking place for centuries. Colonization drew a straight boundary line between the islands, leading to separation of kinship. I think there was a recent case a few years ago between Solomon Islands and Vanuatu over a borderline dispute. That was settled using custom, the traditional way of resolving conflict. So in Fiji, for example, the Minerva Reef, because of territoriality that comes connected with the state these days, disputes are have risen because of that. So it's become more problematic, I'd say, with defining sovereignty, defining territoriality, EEZ. Whereas before, the Pacific Ocean, it was a lane for which people travel, and there was no such thing as a border. And that is some of the ideas that I'm trying to investigate and understand better when looking at what exactly is international relations for Oceania. What did that mean for us? The statehood is often taken from the time that independence was given to Fiji, 1970. But what was that? What did we have before that? This is some of the ideas that I'm trying to draw out and explain it in a way that this is what international relations is understood as in the Pacific region. The relationships between all the islands, is something that I hope that I will develop in my research.
Thank you very much, Maima and William. It's fascinating stuff, very interesting and really great to hear your views on this. We've got one final question. There were a few questions there that were directed specifically to William regarding his research, which I believe have been answered. There's one additional question. It's specifically about Russia and whether Russia will be more involved in Pacific affairs given the current state of affairs of the European continent and its quasi-alliance with China. And I think it'd also be useful just to broaden that out to think about all sorts of different countries, so particularly, for example, or regional blocs like the EU, etc. Do you anticipate there being an even greater increase in the number of non-Pacific Island states being involved in this space? And do you think there's any implications for that that are important to tease out in the context of this geopolitics frame?
I'll start because William and Maima just gave answers to the last question, so I'll give them a break. Look, I think, Russia, William would know far better than me about this, but there was the Russian military equipment provided to Fiji a couple of years ago that caused great consternation. But I don't anticipate, Russia was present in the region during the Cold War. That did cause a great deal of concern in Australia over fisheries. Soviet fishing fleets were reached agreements with various Pacific Island countries that did cause the Australian government in particular a great deal of anxiety. So it's not unforeseeable that Russia, it's not beyond where Russia has operated before the Pacific. My sense is that Russia's probably well occupied in Ukraine and elsewhere, so might not really have the attention or resources to do much in the Pacific. But, the EU has been mentioned. The EU is an important player in the region, although often through France as its proxy, because France has its Pacific territories and has made its presence increasingly felt in recent years. And I guess in terms of the implications, I would just refer to what I said before about the difficulties, the opportunities and the potential risks of having so many partners in the Pacific. Beyond those kind of obvious ones, countries like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia just attended the last Forum Leaders meeting and made a pledge towards the region. You are seeing these players with quite unclear strategic interests, showing an interest in the Pacific. That again has the risks and the opportunities that I mentioned before, but I would add another layer of risk of countries like Saudi Arabia that are less concerned about domestic political developments and domestic political, systems and dynamics. That they may their involvement may perhaps encourage or facilitate some less than a desirable consequences. So yeah, there are but of course funding is always welcome, particularly I think the Saudi donation, Maima or William might know better, was towards the region's Regional Resilience Fund to respond to climate change. So we all, you know, it goes almost, don't need to say it, but just for clarity, that the climate change is an existential threat in the Pacific, and therefore donations towards the resilience facility being set up by the Pacific Islands Forum are welcome. I guess it's just a, you know, again, just that there's every opportunity comes with a potential risk, and this is, you know, it's just adding layers of management for Pacific leaders and Pacific institutions, particularly the forum, that they have to manage. These are, you know, the Pacific Islands Forum is a very effective regional organisation, but it faces resource constraints. And it's just putting, again, added pressure on these institutions to manage all these different players. And this is why it's incumbent on players like Saudi Arabia and others to be responsible about what they're doing in the Pacific, and responsive, as we'd argue.
Fantastic. Well, given the timing, I think it would be best that we draw it to a close. But just to conclude, I'd like to thank once again Joanne, Maima, and William for their presentations and their fantastic answers to the various questions I've asked and the different panelists and attendees have asked. Thank you very much again, and we really look forward to everyone attending future Centre for Geopolitics events. Please follow us on our social media and look at our YouTube, where this video will come up shortly in the coming days. So thank you very much and have a good evening.